Escape over sand and snow, the World War II experiences of RAF airman Arthur Dodds by John Dodds. This is the wartime story of Arthur Whitfield Dodds, who joined the RAF and trained as a navigator and bomb aimer on Wellington Bombers. He saw active service in North Africa. This presentation is in 5 parts: introduction, joining the RAF, his active service in North Africa, Arthur's time as a prisoner of war, and his return to the UK. The bibliography is at the beginning to explain the abbreviations used. I have tried as much as possible to use first-hand accounts for authenticity. The main one is Arthur's own autobiography, Desert Harvest. The cover is shown here. These quotes are always in red with the reference DH. Fortunately, I also had access to the diaries of 3 of Arthur's fellow POWs: Robert Blake, RB, George Burnett, GB, and Beverly Edge, BE. All 3 of these can be viewed on the website of the MSM Trust, which is an excellent resource I highly recommend. See the link. At the start, I also quote extensively from the book Bomber Boys, BB. Section 1, the introduction. This presentation has been prepared by John Dodds, that's Arthur's son. It is a personal record intended primarily for family and friends. Hopefully, it may also be of wider interest. Inevitably, it is a partial account. It does not attempt to be a full and complete record of those momentous times. Every effort has been made to achieve accuracy, but there are bound to be some errors for which I apologise. I welcome any corrections or suggestions, and my email address is given here. Section 2, joining the Royal Air Force. Arthur was one of 4 brothers who all served in the war. Arthur, aged 19, volunteered for the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve after leaving school and was enlisted on the 10th of September 1940. He was trained for the dual roles of navigator and bomb aimer, also sometimes referred to as air observer, on Wellington Bombers. His training in the UK lasted for 17 months. Each member of the bomber crew had their own distinct roles which required particular training. So for Arthur, that was specialist training as navigator and bomb aimer. However, during bombing operations, or sorties, they very much worked as an interdependent team. This is a photo of the Wellington Bomber, affectionately known as the Wimpy. It was the most produced UK bomber in World War II, with over 11,000 produced. This is a photo of the front of the Wellington with the crew about to get on board. Note the bulky clothing of the crew. It was very cold at altitude with little or no heating on the Wellington. But also note the viewing window for the bomb aimer. So at the front of the plane, the floor was transparent, allowing a view down to the ground for the bomb aimer, more of which later. The Wellington would have a crew of 5 or 6. There was the pilot or skipper, which for Arthur the pilot was Bill Astle. There was the navigator and bomb aimer, which of course was Arthur. There'd be a radio operator, a front gunner, a rear gunner, and the 6th member, if present, would be a second pilot. And this was the case when Arthur was shot down. I am unsure of the names of all of the rest of the crew when they were shot down. It was likely to have been 4 of the following who are listed here. This is not the clearest diagram of the interior of the Wellington, but the idea is to show how cramped the conditions were. So from the quote, operating a bomber involves shared responsibility and intense mutual dependence Each mission could last many hours in a claustrophobic metal tube with danger ever present. And you can certainly, I think, see how claustrophobic it is. 4 of the 5 or 6 of the crew are visible. Certainly the tail gunner is not visible in this picture. But you can also see the position the bomb aimer took when running up to drop the bombs. The bomb aimer would be lying flat, looking down through that transparent window we saw in the earlier slide. So Arthur was trained to be the navigator. In the early days, navigators had no radio aids to guide them to targets. It involved manual observation of the stars, use of paper maps, protractors, etc. The navigator's job was the most mentally testing of aircrew tasks, requiring constant alertness at every stage of the journey. And in the photo, you can see there's this little table, and the navigator would be sitting there, plotting maps and checking his calculations, etc. Arthur was also trained to be the bomb aimer. And in the photo, you can see the bomb aimer taking up position, lying flat, looking down through the transparent window at the front of the plane that we've seen earlier. He lay face down in the perspex nose, exposing the length of his body to the flak bursting all around, and more on flak later. Pressing his face to the complicated bomb sight, he called corrections to the pilot, ordered the bomb doors open, and when satisfied, pressed the button that sent the bombs tumbling out into the night. And here we have a photo of the bomb aimer pressing the button. So all the enormous energy devoted to a bombing raid was focused in the last minutes on the hand of one man, who is here pressing the button which will release the bombs to drop down to the target. Section 3, posted overseas to North Africa. On the 9th of February 1942, Pilot Officer Arthur Dodds was posted overseas to North Africa, initially to a transit camp in Egypt. He joined 148 Squadron of Wellington Bombers. This was part of 205 Group, RAF, which operated in North Africa and the Mediterranean. 205 Group was separate to the much larger and better known RAF Bomber Command, which operated in Northern and Western Europe, for example, the bombing raids on Germany. When Arthur arrived in Egypt, the position of the war was bleak. Nearly all of Europe was controlled by the Germans or Italians, as was the Mediterranean. See the map on the next slide. This is a map of the state of the war in February 1942, when Arthur arrived in Egypt. The red or the pink is the enemy, the Axis, areas controlled by the Germans and the Italians. The blue is the British and its allies. Note, most of the Europe and the Mediterranean is controlled by the enemy, the Axis. Malta is highlighted because Arthur was based there for a short time. Malta is a tiny, vulnerable dot of blue, surrounded by the enemy on all sides. Bombing operations involving Arthur in North Africa. In total, Arthur flew 20 sorties or missions before being shot down on his 21st. These included Benghazi Harbour in Libya, which was a vital port for supplying the Germans and the Italians, German and Italian airfields in North Africa, such as Derna, German airfields in Sicily when he was based in Malta, and German submarine pens in Greece. He flew from various places, including a desert landing ground near El Alamein in Egypt, a permanent RAF station near Cairo in Egypt, and for a short time, Malta. This is a modern-day map of North Africa with some key locations for Arthur's story shown by red stars. There's Libya on the left and Egypt on the right. So for these key locations, starting on the far left, the first one is Benghazi, which was this major port for the enemy, and Arthur had a number of bombing missions to Benghazi harbour. Coming round, the next one is Derna, where in fact Arthur was shot down. Next one is Tobruk, which is famous, of course, the site of 2 sieges. Arthur only flew over Tobruk, he was never based there. Further round still, we have the site of one of these desert landing grounds near El Alamein, where Arthur flew from. Then further round on the right, we have the permanent RAF station based near Cairo, where Arthur was also stationed. This is a photo of one of these desert landing grounds or advanced landing grounds. The bomber squadrons in North Africa usually operated from temporary advanced landing grounds. These were scraped out of the bare desert with only a few tents for shelter. And you can see in the photo there's 2 Wellingtons literally just in the middle of the desert with almost no facilities. And Arthur was based at one of these for some of his missions. So for a short time, Arthur was based at Malta and flew from there. Malta, then a British colony, was one of the most intensively bombed areas during the war. The people of Malta had shown extreme bravery, and King George VI made a unique gesture. He awarded the George Cross to the whole Maltese nation, an honour which is still borne by the Maltese on their flag today, and you can see the Maltese flag in the photo. Now, in red, we have the first extract or quotation from Arthur's autobiography, Desert Harvest. That's shown in red and in italics. The squadron left for a short spell in Malta at the height of the siege of the island. Our task was to fit in as many raids as possible on the German airfields in Sicily before our own aircraft were destroyed. It was a humbling experience to witness the courageous and resilient spirit of the Maltese people, whose homes and towns were just piles of rubble, and who were deprived of food, water, electricity, etc. Yet they lined the route and cheered us all the way as our old bus bumped its way to Lucca Airfield each evening for our night raids. Arthur was in one of the 10 planes sent to Malta on the 21st of April 1942. Of these 10, only 2 planes survived to return to Egypt 5 days later on April the 26th. The other 8 had been destroyed either on the ground by bombing or shot down. This shows the position of the front line between the opposing armies in May 1942, which is when Arthur was shot down. The Axis, the enemy, are in black, mainly obviously on the left of the picture, and the British and their allies are shown in blue on the right. The front line shifted considerably backwards and forwards during the Desert War. On his last mission, when he was shot down, Arthur flew from a desert landing ground near El Alamein, ALG 106, shown in yellow on the right, and he was shot down near to Derna in Libya, shown in yellow on the left. The very high casualty rate for bomber crews in World War II. For Bomber Command, that's in Northern and Western Europe, overall an incredible 44.4% of those that flew were killed. This was a worse life expectancy than for soldiers on the Western Front in World War I. Serving in bombers in North Africa, i.e. 205 group, such as Arthur, was less dangerous, but still many were shot down and many were killed, with over 3,000 killed or missing. For Bomber Command, only 25% completed a full tour of 30 missions. For 205 group, the figure was quite a bit higher at 56%, but of course that meant that 44% didn't complete a full tour. The photo shows the gravestones of some of these many Allied air crew that were shot down and killed over North Africa. The gravestones are from one of the cemeteries in North Africa. The photo shows the wreckage of a Wellington on a beach in North Africa during World War II. So what were the dangers for a bomber crew? They could be shot down by enemy fighters. They could be shot down by flak. Now, you've seen this word flak before. It's basically anti-aircraft fire from guns on the ground. And these could involve both tracer bullets and heavier, what were sometimes called ACAC shells. There could be mechanical failures. There could be errors in navigation. So some more on this flak. The photo is a genuine one from World War II, and this is typical photograph of flak. That, remember, is gunfire from the ground, and this is what it would look like. It would be this intense for a heavily defended target such as Benghazi. Now, the quote at the top is from Arthur. Unlike the heavy concentrations of flak we usually encountered over Benghazi harbour, which, if you remember, he did a number of missions to. We have some idea of what this must have felt like from a journalist, Alexander Clifford. He was on board a Wellington for a similar bombing raid, and this therefore would have been Arthur's experience over Benghazi. And the journalist's description is in purple. I peered out of the plane's transparent nose to see earth and sky slash with flame. String after string of red tracer shells spurted up like ruby necklaces. ACAC shells were bursting, splashed the sky with sudden stars. Stuff was coming up all around us. And one of my most vivid memories of my father talking about his war was him describing just this, and how absolutely terrifying it was for him looking down through the viewing window at the front of the plane and seeing this incredible amount of stuff coming up towards him, being convinced that one of them surely must hit him, must hit the plane. Absolutely terrifying. Quote at the top is from Arthur. We had returned one night, i.e. from one mission, with no less than 36 holes in the aircraft. Now, the photograph is not Arthur's plane, but shows clearly the dangers of bombing missions. I mean, most of this damage in the photograph would have been probably from flak, but it also shows the incredible robustness of the Wellington. And amazingly, the plane in the photo, even with all that damage, managed to return safely to base. The dramatic moments when Arthur's plane is shot down. The quotes in red and green are from Arthur. So just after midnight on 31st of May 1942, a Wellington bomber was shot down over the Western Desert in Libya. And this is still Arthur speaking in red. We anticipated an easy trip. Our target was a new German airfield near Derna. We were light-hearted and cheerful as we set out, anticipating little flak on this trip. We had just completed our first bombing run when the rear gunner shouted a warning of an enemy fighter approaching. As he finished speaking, tracer bullets ripped through the aircraft. The second pilot received bullets across his chest. The rear gunner reported his turret was on fire and that he was wounded. The skipper was on the intercom. He told us to get on our parachutes in preparation for bailing out. The second pilot, however, was now back on his feet. Incredibly, his heart had been saved by a torch in his breast pocket, so the bullets had hit the torch and he was not killing him. I went forward to help the second pilot get his chute on. I told the skipper I would try and put out the fire in the starboard wing. The other 4 crew members successfully bailed out. They parachuted out, assisted by Arthur, who had stayed on board to help. Bill was then able to crash land the plane in the desert. I just had time to brace myself before the crash. Bill yelled, "Get out quick!" I collected a map, a small escape compass, my loaded revolver, and my water bottle, with only about a third of a pint. That's less than 200 ml. As I scrambled out of the burning aircraft, The skipper shouted, "Run for it!" "What about the others?" I called. "They've all bailed out," he said, and as he began to run, I poked my head into the rear door of the plane and yelled and looked just to make sure. I then ran and threw myself down beside Bill just as the aircraft exploded. This very vivid painting provides an illustration of what the attack could have been like. It's daytime, so it's definitely not Arthur's plane, although it is a Wellington. And Arthur's quote, "When the rear gunner shouted a warning of an enemy fighter approaching, as he finished speaking, tracer bullets ripped through the aircraft." This photo is of the grave of Arthur's pilot, Arthur's captain, Bill Astle. The grave is in Germany. And quoting Arthur, "As a crew, we had already completed some 20 sorties under our experienced skipper and first pilot, Bill Astle, DFC, later killed on the famous Dambusters raid." As we'll find out later, although Arthur ends up as a prisoner of war, Bill survives a walk across the desert, gets back to the UK, and is selected for the famous Dambusters raid. Sadly, he's piloting one of the first planes to get shot down on that raid, and he was killed almost exactly 1 year after the crash with Arthur. So Bill was killed over the night of the 16th, 17th of May, 1943. So he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the DFC, for his actions in the crash landing and the escape attempt he shared with Arthur. Trying to escape to safety, the walk through the desert sands from the 1st to the 6th of June, 1942. Arthur and Bill were now faced with the huge challenge of walking approximately 80 miles, that's nearly 130 kilometres, through the German-occupied Libyan desert to reach the safety of the British positions. And we'll see this on a map in a minute. They had no food and very little water. Daytime temperatures would be very high. They would have to walk at night and find shelter in the day from the sun and from the enemy. It would be a severe physical challenge, a major test of endurance. Arthur was also about to embark on a different sort of challenge, which would be of great significance to the rest of his life. And this is quoting Arthur. "All my life I'd had a niggling thought deep inside me that I ought to become a clergyman, but I'd flunked the idea. As we started on this long walk, knowing that it was likely to be a very long one, I thought that here was an ideal opportunity to think and pray this thing through and come to a decision one way or the other. On the third day of the walk, sheltering under a thorn bush, he made his decision, committing himself to God and deciding to become a clergyman if he survived. All through his wartime experiences, his deep faith was an essential comfort to him and helped him to cope and survive. And in fact, after the war, he did become a Church of England vicar." So this is a map of that desert escape attempt. So the two of them are attempting to walk approximately 80 miles from the site of the crash landing, which is shown in yellow. That's near Derna, the red star, along that yellow arrow towards the safety of the British and Allied troops, which are shown in blue towards the right of the picture. They've started off, of course, in enemy territory. The black is the German and Italian troops, and they've got to walk till they reach safety at the front line there between the black and the blue. And Arthur so nearly made it. Tragically, he was captured just 180 meters short of that safety of the British lines. Bill, in fact, did make it, as we'll find out later. So now we have Arthur's description of that walk through the desert sands, trying to escape to safety. And this is Arthur now, quoted in red. The terrain was difficult in parts, with broken, craggy rocks. Bill and I walked and walked, urging each other on, as first one, then the other would stagger, especially in the later stages. As the first night gave way to dawn, we found a lovely cave. I found 1 ear of unripe corn. We shared it between us. I also found a packet of wine gums, which are sweets, in my pocket, which gave us 4 each. That was my last food for 5 days, the 5 days of the walk. But already it was water for which we craved. That cave gave us ideal shelter from the heat of the sun and the prying eyes of German patrols or planes. Suddenly we came upon a German camp. A nearby tent had a good-sized shrub or bush next to it, and we noticed a water can near the door of the tent. Although there were stirrings within the tent, Bill very bravely picked up the can. He took a couple of good swigs and handed it on to me. We put the can back, got into the shrub, and looked forward to the rest of the water that night. We slept reasonably well, surprisingly, in the bush, despite the noises and the comings and goings. One soldier actually stopped right by the shrub where we were. Then we felt a splash. He'd urinated on the bush right over our heads, and then he'd walked on. When at last all was quiet, we came out, took the can, and now barely a quarter full, and headed south. Once well clear of the camp, we took a good swig of the water. 2 swigs later, and the water was all gone. By now we were living skeletons. I looked at Bill as he lay there. His skin was like thin yellow parchment, stretched tight across his skull-like face, and I knew that I must look the same. We waited until it was quite dark that 6th night before we headed east, hoping to reach our own troops before dawn. After a while, we found ourselves amongst a small groups of German troops. We were challenged. Remember, it's actually at night, so they can't be seen that clearly. And Bill, who luckily spoke good German, just said, "We are the signallers," and kept going. Incredibly, they had got away with it. By now they were very close to the British troops, but became separated when Bill went to investigate a possible British patrol. After walking through a minefield, fortunately unharmed, Bill eventually reached safety. But back to Arthur now. This is Arthur. I was walking now in a kind of faint, unable to hear or see other than in a fog. As I was climbing out of the quarry and looking back, I walked right into an Italian sentry and collapsed at his feet. Beyond him, I later discovered, was no man's land, with safety only 180 meters away. I was a prisoner. While researching this presentation, I found out that Arthur and Bill's exploits in the desert were certainly not unique. So I came across a number of examples. This is just one. So this rather splendid photo of these two who parachuted out of their bomber in October 1942, and they spent an incredible 24 days in the North African desert before reaching safety. As was usual practice, about 2 weeks after Arthur was shot down and then captured, Arthur's parents received from the authorities what was called a missing in action letter. And these are 2 extracts from that official missing in action letter. So, dear Mr. Dodds, by the time you receive this letter, you will have been informed of the very distressing news that your son, Pilot Officer Arthur Dodds, is missing from operations against the enemy. The captain, on his return, emphasized the gallant part played by your son in the aircraft, both when it was being attacked and in assisting the crew, some of whom were wounded, in bailing out. He also said how stout-hearted he had been when they were walking together, and how he could not have gone on alone without so courageous a comrade. Section 4. Arthur is now a prisoner of war in Italy. Initially, he was at Chieti prison camp in central Italy for about a year, and then he was at nearby Sulmona camp, and he escaped from Sulmona camp in October 43. So, life in prison camp. Preoccupations were food, boredom, and escape. And then here's two more quotes from Arthur in red. Food was a central subject for all. Our diet was very limited, both in quantity and quality, but it was backed up by occasional Red Cross parcels. In terms of boredom, the prisoners soon became highly organised, with lectures arranged on many subjects. Arthur joined a class preparing a group of prisoners for church ordination. Back to Arthur. Also, bridge was a major time consumer in camp. Nearly everyone played. That's the card game bridge. Sports of many kinds took place, but soccer matches were only played for 10 minutes each way because of our severe undernourishment. The camp was very secure, so escape would be very difficult. Individual escape attempts were strongly discouraged. Any plans had to be approved by the official escape committee. By early September 43, Italy had surrendered, and Germans took over the camp and planned to move all the prisoners, firstly to another camp nearby, and then on to Germany. We now have the plan to escape from the camp by hiding in the hut roof. So on the 23rd of September, Arthur and the other prisoners were transferred from Chieti to Sulmona camp, prior to further transfer to Germany. We now have the first quote from one of the other prisoners of war, which is Robert Blake, in purple. We agreed that our last chance of escape had come. There were three possibilities, tunnelling being ruled out for lack of time. Hiding somewhere in the camp was the option we chose, pending the expected arrival of advancing Allied troops from the south. In Sulmona camp, a group of 5 prisoners were involved in a scheme to hide in the roof of a hut. These 5 were Arthur Dodds, Robert or Bobby Blake, George Burnett, Kenneth Lowe, and Beverly Edge. The 5 went into hiding in the roof on the 30th of September 1943, which happened to be George's birthday. They only expected to have to hide for a week at most, so they only had supplies really they thought would be enough to last them a week. They were expecting liberation by the Allies very soon, because they were by now, the Allies were very close to Sulmona. Unfortunately, in the end, the Allies did not arrive in time, and they had to hide for 18 days rather than the week they expected, until the 18th of October, when they emerged and managed to escape from the camp. We're incredibly lucky to have this sketch, and in fact the sketch on the next page. The sketches were done at the time while they were actually in the camp and hiding in the roof by Beverly Edge. Beverly Edge left the sketches, which were part of a diary, and you can see an extract from the diary also on its side on the bottom right. So the diary and these sketches were left in the roof of the hut, and incredibly were sort of rediscovered, if you like, in 1964 and returned to Beverly Edge, who survived the war, and he was living in the UK. So they returned to Beverly Edge in the UK. So we were very lucky to have these. This sketch is of the hut they actually hid in, and I don't know if you can see in the centre there, there's like, it looks like a ladder coming down from the roof with some people at the bottom. That is them escaping, as we'll see in a minute. And then a quote from Arthur in yellow: from outside the hut, under the eaves, it was possible to take out 2 lines of bricks above the ceiling line. Through this hole, a slim person could squeeze without damaging the ceiling. With the bricks replaced by helpers on the outside, we could hopefully hide in the ceiling space. So this is the second sketch from Beverly Edge's diary, with a cutaway diagram to show how they hid themselves in this roof space, so above the ceiling but below the roof line. But it was a very small space. You'll see the quote actually from Beverly. There is only just over 0.9 meters headroom in the middle of the roof. There is just enough room for the 5 of us to lie flat. And you can see in orange the five prisoners just about all squashed in there. And there's a couple of other features shown. Firstly, on the far right is their sort of toilet arrangements, which was basically a tin. And of course, sensibly, that was positioned as far away from where they slept as possible. And therefore, there's a walkway, a single plank running along the roof, the middle of the roof, to reach the toilet there, but very difficult to operate, and they had to be very careful reaching that toilet. The second feature shown in blue writing is a spy hole. That was their only, in fact, partial view of what was going on down in the main part of the hut below them, this spy hole. You can see one person looking down through that. Enduring the challenging conditions in the hut roof for 18 days. This is just a list of some of the problems for these 5 prisoners of war in that hut roof. So conditions were very cramped. No room to stand up, sitting or lying only, with just enough room for all 5 to lie down. There was almost complete darkness. There was no windows from where they were, and they only had this tiny little peephole. So they had very little light through small gaps. Reading was only possible when there was full sunlight outside. There was the constant risk of discovery, so the need to remain silent, talking only in whispers. There was strictly rationed food and water. Remember, they were there for much longer than they anticipated. And it was very claustrophobic. They were unable to see outside, and they only had this tiny peephole giving partial sight of the hut interior. We now have a couple of extracts from the diaries of 2 of the other prisoners of war. The purple one is from Beverly Edge, and the lower one in green is from Robert or Bobby Blake, giving a feel for what the conditions must have been like for them at the time. So firstly then, the top quote: "Our living quarters are a section of the roof with only about 0.9 meter headroom in the middle, sloping to nothing at the sides. The floor is of good strong planks laid loosely over the beams. Toilet arrangements are rather tricky. Our main contraption is a tin box on a small platform at the end of the roof. It is reached by crawling on all 4s along single planks running down the middle of the roof. It is a slow and tiring journey, as everything we do must be done absolutely silently. One false step, cough or bumped head may give us away." Now moving on to Bobby Blake in green. "It was cramped and uncomfortable lying on the planks. We could see nothing of what was going on outside, depending entirely on our hearing, which by the end of our stay in the roof had become incredibly acute. The only light came through small chinks between the roof tiles. Arthur," that's Arthur Dodds, of course, "Arthur studied the Bible, and George his much-loved Culbertson's book of bridge. We had a pack of cards and tried to play patience, occasionally even bridge. My only reading was a pocket English-Italian dictionary to improve my Italian." In the previous slide, there was reference to the various reading that the prisoners of war did in the hut roof, and what kept them occupied for that 18 long days. And George Burnett basically kept himself occupied with Culbertson's Summary of Contract Bridge. This was his much loved Culbertson. So just for interest and for fun, really, I managed to track down what was almost certainly the same book. This is the 1940 edition shown in the picture, Culbertson's Summary of Contract Bridge. It was a shame, really, that George didn't also have what you see on the right, which is, in fact, a later edition, but an Italian edition, because that could have helped him improve his Italian, which, as we will see, could have been very useful later on. Another quotation in blue or purple, this time from Beverly Edge. And I really appreciate the humour here. Given the conditions they were under, it's wonderful that they retained their sense of humour. So this is Beverly Edge. Hope we shall not have to spend much longer up here. No wash or shave for over a week makes one feel a bit scruffy. I also remove my socks and give my feet a good airing each and every day. I'm expecting someone to kick up a row about this, but so far it has passed without comment. Wonderful. Unfortunately, things get worse for the five of them. German soldiers take up residence in the same hut. Before that, the hut had been empty. Now, as we see from the quotes, the first quote in green from Bobby Blake, the second in red from George Burnett. There are about a dozen soldiers. They lived below us for 3 days. The days were very noisy, shouting and hammering, and playing a gramophone with apparently only one record, the Lambeth Walk, repeated ad nauseam. And then from George Burnett, still the same 3 days with the soldiers present. We resolved to stay awake at night in order not to give ourselves away by snoring or movement. These nights were intensely uncomfortable, and in the mornings we could scarcely move for cramp and stiffness. The slightest move at night gave rise to a chorus of whispered curses and warnings. And the situation gets even worse. By now the camp had been mostly emptied, but the Germans suspected that some prisoners were hiding. A British prisoner was sent to each hut to announce the following. And the quotes in both these cases in purple are from George Burnett. All people left hiding up must come out now. They will be given half an hour. After that, hand grenades, i.e. bombs, will be thrown in all the buildings. We heard the first of these explosions at about 09:30. They sounded very terrifying. Bobby had his eye to the peephole when a black object came hurtling through one of the windows and fell with a sharp smack on the concrete floor. Bobby thought, that's it. It's a grenade. We've had it. We'll be blown up. But the object proved to be only an old shoe. What a relief. In fact, the huts on either side of them were blown up, so they all had a very lucky escape. On the 12th of October, we cut our water rations to 2/5 of a pint, that's about just over 200 ml, and our biscuit ration to 2 biscuits per man per day. Further reductions had to be made very shortly afterwards. We were all heartily sick of the darkness and enclosure of the roof. The strain of constant listening and having to talk in whispers was beginning to tell, and we were becoming fractious with one another. The escape from the camp. This is a detailed sketch map done by George Burnett of the Sulmona camp. The hut that they were hiding in, the five of them, is highlighted in green. You can see it down towards the centre bottom. The quote at the top from Arthur refers to the fact that they decided that they'd split into two groups when they tried to leave the camp, so that hopefully, even if one group was caught, the other group might then get through, escape. And in fact, that's what happened. So, quoting Arthur, for safety, Edge and Lowe would attempt to get out one side, in fact, the bottom of the picture, the E and the L. George, Bobby and I would attempt the other side, so that's the BBD at the top. So the 18th of October 1943, they leave the roof and escape from the camp. And this is quoting Arthur in red. The day came when our meagre supplies of food and water were finished, and we must leave the roof. We waited until midnight, removed the bricks, and quietly let down the long plank. One by one, we slid to the ground. I crawled to a nearby water tap and just drank and drank. Gradually, the feeling and the use of my legs returned. And in fact, in the sketch of the huts, which you saw quite a few slides ago, you could see a little sketch of this long plank let down so they could escape from the roof and get down to the ground. Two places were best for attempting to get out through gaps in the wall. Beyond, there was a floodlit mud road and then two lines of barbed wire with sentry boxes every 36 metres or so. Edge and Low would attempt to get out one side. George, Bobby and I would attempt the other side. We lay by the hole in the wall, watching the guard in his sentry box. We waited until all seemed to have been quiet. Slowly George began to crawl on his belly across the brilliantly lit road towards the wire and began to lever it up. I started to crawl towards him across the road and Bobby followed. In turn, each of us held up the wire for the other to crawl underneath, and eventually all three were outside. It had taken an hour. We were free. What a moment of great relief and exhilaration, but we could not stay and enjoy it. We must put as much distance as possible between the camp and ourselves before daylight. Sadly, the other two, Low and Edge, had been recaptured as soon as they left the camp. However, they both survived the war. It is very fortunate that we have a photograph of what's now 3 escapees taken in Chieti camp in 1943. So there's Arthur Dodds on the left, Bobby Blake on the right, and George Burnett in the centre. And the quote at the bottom is from Arthur in red. I was very blessed in my companions. George was a major and the senior among us. He was a natural leader and a man of balanced judgment. Bobby had picked up a good deal of the Italian language with his keen, retentive mind. I could do little except pray. Just a little bit about George and Bobby's background. George and Bobby were in the same unit of the Royal Artillery. They were captured together at Tobruk. And if you remember Tobruk, you could see on one of those earlier maps of North Africa, that Tobruk is in Libya. Escape from the camp. The 3 escapees were befriended by local Italians who helped them shelter in barns, etc. in the countryside and provided food for the next 17 days. And this quote is from Bobby Blake in blue. We settled down for the night on the stone floor of the ruins of a broken down dwelling. On the way, I passed out altogether, and when I came to, I felt incapable of any action. It is at times like these that one is so grateful for companionship. George and Arthur were stronger than I was at this particular moment. On my own, I would have thrown in the sponge. I would have given up. They kept me going at the darkest moment of my life. My gratitude is infinite, however inexpressible. Several different Italian families were involved in helping the escapees. The next quote is Arthur. This family, like others we met, were so warm-hearted and generous as they risked their lives on our behalf, we who were their former enemies. Many were shot, either because of their involvement in helping prisoners of war or simply as a reprisal or deterrent. Many had their houses burnt to the ground, and what little possessions they owned were confiscated or stolen. By early November, it was clear that they needed better accommodation, and on November the 5th, they moved to the small flat of the De Cesare family inside the actual town of Sulmona. Here is a modern-day photograph of the town of Sulmona, and you can see its position just right next to these very impressive mountains, which is the Maella range of the Apennines. Now, this photo is taken in the summer, and the reason for the quote at the top is that the three escapees will have to try and climb over those mountains to reach the advancing Allied troops and therefore reach safety. And therefore, Arthur's quote at the top, we would need a good guide to get us through the Maella range of the Apennines in winter. So if this photo is in the summer, you can imagine, of course, in winter, there'd be far, far more snow on those mountains. Conditions would be much more difficult. So they were sheltered for 10 weeks by this very brave de Cesare family in Sulmona. This 10 weeks happened to include both Arthur and Bobby's birthdays. And there's a quote in brown from George Burnett and then in blue from Bobby Blake. It was about 1.5 miles to the house, which turned out to be in a large block of working people's flats. The de Cesare flat was on the first floor with an excellent view onto the main street, along which passed a stream of German transport. There were many Germans billeted in the town and many more in transit passing through. So in effect, they were living in this flat, surrounded by Germans throughout the town. Yesterday was Bobby's birthday, and these good people, evidently a considerable effort and sacrifice to themselves, provided us with an excellent supper and an extra ration of vino. And now in blue from Bobby Blake. Last night, Dodds, i.e. Arthur, made excellent porridge with some oats, sugar and clim milk. It was very unpalatable to our hosts, however. Zia ate a plateful, but unfortunately was sick afterwards. Now we have another sketch by George Burnett, this time of the de Cesare family flat where they were sheltered for 10 weeks in the heart of this town. And as you can see from the diagram, it really was a very small, just 3-room flat. And there was 3 members of the family and the 3 escapees. So 6 people in total living in this very small flat with Germans all around. We now have a quote from Bobby Blake. The chief danger for us, living in the flat, was what was called a rastrellamento, literally a combing out. It was a matter of the Germans press-ganging young Italians into temporary forced labour. They were not particularly on the lookout for prisoners of war, but a search of the flats was as likely to catch us as the Italian youths. I came to dread the cry of rastrellamento, for it meant climbing through a trap door above the toilet into the roof. And of course we'd had enough of roofs by then. And waiting cold, covered with dust and cobwebs, for hours until the all clear was announced. Sometimes we were ushered into the neighbouring flat of a family called De Berardo. Meanwhile, life was one of boredom, interspersed by continuous alarms. Escape over the mountains through the snow. Allied troops had invaded Italy and were by now fairly close to Sulmona. They were advancing up from the south. Reaching the Allied troops would require climbing over the nearby Maella range of mountains, which were part of the Apennines, and you saw those mountains in the photo earlier. There were other escapees also hiding in Sulmona. A guide was essential, and Alberto, a local shepherd known as the Wolf of the Mountains, agreed to take a party of about 25. It was an ordeal of 2 nights and 2 days, walking for approximately 50 kilometers in the deep snow of midwinter. They left on the 12th of January 1944 and reached the safety of British troops on the 14th of January. This is a map showing the approximate route of their escape over the mountains through the snow. Sulmona is shown with a purple line. You can find that towards the top of the diagram. Sulmona itself is an orange dot to the left. There's a red arrow, which is the actual route of the escape, and then a red star, which is where they met up with Allied troops. They got to safety near Cassoli. The orange line, which you can see running from top to bottom, is something famous called the Gustav line. and it was a series of German fortifications intended to divide Italy in two. One of the main strong points along this series of fortifications was Cassino, or the Monte Cassino, which was quite famous and the site of very fierce fighting. That's down towards the bottom of this line. At the time of Arthur's escape in January 44, the Allies were trying to break through this Gustav line. They'd been moving up through Italy to the right of your picture and had reached this point. To the left of your picture, the Germans are still there. They're trying to hold on to as much of Italy as they can. The Allies, of course, are trying to clear the Germans out of Italy altogether. So the Germans were making a stand at this point, and it took many months for the Allies, in fact, to get through this Gustav line. So at the time of Arthur's escape in January 44, the Allies were trying to break through this Gustav line, and as you can see, very close to Sulmona. This breakthrough was not fully achieved until June 44, which is when Sulmona was liberated. Arthur, Bobby and George's escape route over the mountains would have been approximately the same as the modern-day annual Freedom Trail. So this is the Sulmona Freedom Trail, taking place every year, or in Italian, Il Sentiero della Libertà. This is a commemorative trek of 60 kilometers over 3 days with about 500 participants, mainly students. It usually takes place at the end of April each year. It follows the escape route for many escaped Allied prisoners, not just Arthur, Bobby and George, and for Italians who were opposing the Germans. And you can see in the map, a much more detailed map of the route, and that would be very much the same route as what Arthur, Bobby and George took, starting from Sulmona on the left and reaching Casoli on the right. Here are two photographs of this annual Sulmona Freedom Trail. There is now some descriptions of this arduous walk over the mountains through the snow. This first quotation is from George Burnett in purple. There was an alarm early on, and we hid for a few minutes in a vineyard, then on again. We waded through a mountain torrent and then began to climb more steeply, soon getting into frozen snow, which was lying about 6 inches thick. We went on very slowly now, often staggering and sometimes lying in the snow to rest. About 4 a.m. we had a long rest, and then Bobby and I pushed on again. We were nearing the top and the going was very steep. We decided to rest until Arthur should catch up, but Arthur did not arrive, and I lose track of things until I remember that it was about 0800 hours, the sun was up, and we were climbing the last few hundred feet onto the summit of the Maella at about 2,100 meters. These quotes are from Arthur. We came into an open expanse of snow, and I suddenly went through the frozen crust and found myself up to my armpits in snow. In my exhaustion, I just wanted to rest and soon began to doze off. Suddenly I came to, realizing that I must not sleep, or that would be the end of me. I struggled onto the surface again and tried to catch up with the rest of the group, now well ahead. That probably was what was happening when the other two, if you remember in the last slide, said how they waited for Arthur and Arthur didn't turn up. This is presumably what had happened. On this trek over the mountains, the snow and the Germans are not the only danger. We now have a quote from Bobby Blake in green. There was a discordant cross between a howl and a wail from a ridge, and silhouetted against the moonlight, we saw a couple of wolves. We could see others from the pack. We had been warned about wolves as a hazard in the mountains, but I had not really believed it. The pack shadowed us for a mile or two. I was not unduly frightened, for I had read that even a pack will not attack a body of men as long as they keep together. However, a straggler would be another matter. I walked more carefully than ever from then on. Finally, freedom. The first quote is from Arthur, the second quote is from George Burnett. By 9:30 a.m. on the 14th of January, we were straggling into an advanced position of the Royal West Kents. These were British troops who were based near Kassoli. And then George Burnett in blue. It was an inexpressible relief to be with our own troops again, to talk English to British soldiers. Above all, there was a wonderful sense of relaxation after the fatigues of the journey, to know that we were no longer of the hunted, liable to betrayal by everyone. So, after all that he had been through since being captured, Arthur was finally free. Section 5. Return to the UK. Arthur, Bobby and George left Italy by boat on the 26th of January 44, arriving back in the UK in early February. Arthur was posted to an RAF station in North Wales in charge of navigational training. Here he met his future wife Letty, who was an officer in the WAF, that's the Women's Air Force. He was discharged from the RAF on 09/08/44 with the rank of Flight Lieutenant. Recognition of Arthur. Arthur was mentioned in dispatches twice. This is an award for distinguished service. One, along with Bobby and George, was for providing information on German troop movements in Sulmona. The other was probably for his actions during the crash landing. After leaving the RAF, Arthur studied theology at Oxford University and then went to theological college to train for the ministry. He was ordained a priest of the Church of England in 1951. Arthur, Bobby and George remained friends and kept in contact for the rest of their lives. This is a wonderful postscript. In 1993, no less than 50 years after their escape from the prison camp, Arthur, Bobby and George returned together to Sulmona. And there's two photographs here from that return. On the left-hand side, you have the three of them, obviously 50 years on, George on the left, Arthur in the centre, and Bobby on the right. And standing in front of literally the actual hut where they hid. It's still there, it's still used as an army camp, and they hid in that roof you can see behind them. On the right-hand photograph is the front of the block of flats where they were sheltered in Sulmona for those 10 weeks. And they were on this first floor flat. Some final thoughts. One of the many things that stands out from this memoir is the incredible mental, physical and emotional resilience of Arthur and the other escapees. And of course, Arthur, Bobby and George were not unique. There were so many acts of courage and endurance by so many individuals, overseas and at home. Also importantly, we must not forget the bravery of all the local people in Italy and elsewhere who assisted escaping Allied soldiers at great risk to themselves. They really were all part of the greatest generation. This presentation is dedicated to the memory of Arthur Dodds and his companions, Bobby Blake, George Burnett and Bill Astell, without whose support he might not have survived. I should also like to briefly thank both Letitia Blake, that's Bobby Blake's daughter, and my cousin Richard Dodds for their help in this project. At the bottom there is an acknowledgement regarding the title of my presentation. To end on a lighter note, this is a 1940 cartoon emphasising the supposed supernatural strength of the Wellington structure. Only another 1,000 miles, Charlie, and we'll be home. That is the end. Thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting.